I think it's great to be here at the invitation of Liverpool Engage. I'd like to thank Liverpool Engage for engaging us in this way and bringing us into this totally fantastic space to talk about another totally fantastic space, which is the Liverpool North Docks. Just thinking about this, I was realising that actually I've known that bit of waterfront longer than practically any other. My grandfather worked in the Custom House and was actually inside the building when it was bombed in the Second World War, after which he was relocated in the Dock Port building. My uncle Tony, who's now in an old people's home in Formby, who I visited this morning, worked in the Royal Liver building, and then he crossed Water Street to work in West Africa House. And the other thing that I realised with a slight shock was that my very first experience of public speaking was on a rather rickety little sort of ladder contraption put up by the Catholic Evidence Guild at Pierhead in 1963, exactly 50 years ago, in which I lectured on this, or spoke against the disputatious counter-heckling of evangelists on the subject of purgatory. And the real surprise is to discover I still have my speaking notes for that. So, friends, you didn't thought you'd come to hear about Waterfront, but I can tell you all about purgatory as I thought about it in those days. It was obviously I realised that you had to start a speech if you were standing at Pierhead in a blustery March day with something striking. So my first words were stroke, apoplexy, blood clot, brain, death. It comes to so that was my lead into the topic of purgatory, for which, as a heckler informed me, there is no scriptural warrant, and I think he probably was right on that. But I was thinking about purgatory. I mean, the gist of this lecture 50 years ago was that it's not heaven and it's not hell. It's a place where you wait. And a place of waiting actually is rather a good description of the North Docks. It's not heaven, it's not hell, it's a place of waiting. And what I want to do is just sort of think about the North Docks for a little bit. And then I'm not going to talk any more about the North Docks. I'm going to talk about comparable places around the British Isles. But I mean, the North Docks is the most amazing area next to a central business district. Everywhere else in Britain, dock areas, the redevelopment is, we're sort of more or less dusting our hands. The job is done. But the biggest job for Liverpool has still to be started. And if you ever make the mistake, which I've made more than once, of being in central Liverpool with a bicycle and thinking, well, I'll just cycle out to Blundellsands along the Regent Road, it gives you the true sense of how enormous this site is. Impressive gate after impressive gate. And the entrances are truly wonderful. The wall is listed. So whatever happens to the North Docks, we will continue to have this sequence of wonderful early 19th century masonry gates and the long brick wall which separates off the dock area from the Regent Road. 60 hectares, 2 kilometres in length, a £6 billion project to redevelop this site. So what I want to do is just sort of reflect on the Liverpool Docks from a sideways perspective. I mean, you're going to be hearing from Peel, and there's lots more to be said about that specific site and about the equally astonishing, even more astonishing in a way, Stanley docks and the tobacco warehouse and so on, which are being developed by another developer. But let's sort of take as the starting point Here we are, an island nation, a maritime nation. And throughout British history, we have lived by trade and by maritime activity. So Liverpool is not unique. This country is full of docks and full of dockland redevelopments. And wherever you go, whichever point of the compass you choose, you're going to come across waterfronts, and waterfronts which have been through the same process of regeneration. London has already been referred to, and London has huge waterfronts extending right through the city, the main docks, all the Thames frontage, and all the canals, and there are several through London. But of course London is only the starting point of a journey which can lead us right the way around the British Isles, including some very, very large dockland redevelopment projects. I mean, I was just totting up Edinburgh, so I don't know if I can get the mouse to work, but anyway, you know Edinburgh, is most astonishing because Leith Harbour is 330 hectares, Granton is 14 hectares, Leith Docks is 150 hectares, the Western Harbour is 40 hectares, so that's 700 hectares altogether, which, doing the quick calculation, is 1,700 acres. So these are enormous, enormous projects in Liverpool, and then in Edinburgh, you've also got Glasgow, and then the huge area of Belfast, not to mention Cardiff waterfront, and Bristol, cosier, but still a very, very significant dockland prototype. And then, as if that wasn't enough, we've also got all the inland docks. So if you add in all the canal waterfronts, which again are not insignificant, in Birmingham, the Brindley Place redevelopment, right in the centre of the city, just tucked away behind City Hall and the Public Library, Leeds, Sheffield, Nottingham, all of these places, waterfront redevelopment has really been the big story in town. It was Castle Wharf, which in Nottingham, which brought in the inland revenue and has led to a complete revolution in residential development at the heart of the city. And in Manchester, where I have been based for the past 17 or 18 years, the story of waterfront development is a double-decker story, because we have not only, of course, our ocean-going quaysides redeveloped along the Salford docks, but we've also got all the canal frontages, the Rochdale Canal and the Ashton Canal, and I might say a bit more, and so similarly of Leeds and so forth. So what can we say about waterfront development? So in a way I'm taking Rowan's theme and then I'm sort of tying it down more specifically to waterfronts. I suppose what's happened in the past years is that we've discovered a sort of formula. And it's worthwhile just going through the bits of the formula. First point is, if you've got a dock, don't fill it in. It might seem bloody obvious to us now, but it wasn't obvious 25 years ago. Here we have the Canada docks in London, which were filled in with GLC landfill. In Bristol, they were well advanced in the process of filling in the famous floating harbour. Liverpool similarly had plans to infill its docks until Michael Heseltine intervened and said, whatever you do, don't tip your rubbish in to the docks and treat it as a brownfield site. And he said exactly the same thing. It was Michael Heseltine was the minister who stopped dock infill in the case of London. So lesson one is water adds value. Not for nothing is it called Liverpool Waters. Water, dear friends, is the magic ingredient. It's amazing what you can do with water. And the second thing is, history is magic ingredient number two. Docks have a past. They have all the apparatus of cargo handling, cranes and bollards and steps and warehouses, quaysides, all the rest of it. And this afternoon, Jerry and I had a wonderful tour of the Stanley Dock, with the developer, the Dublin-based developer, Harcourt Developments, incredibly likeable man, Patrick Power, who came out with this wonderful quote. He said, history, I always like to work with historical sites, because if you work on a greenfield site, you have to invent everything. You have to invent a name for the place, you have to invent a branding. He said, in his inimitable, is it Cork accent? I don't know where he comes from. He said, with a historic building, your job is half done. So the branding is there ready-made. Stanley Dock, there you are, you've got it. And they're keeping the buildings, and they're keeping the cranes, and they're keeping the bollards, and they're keeping the flagstones. They're keeping pretty well every sort of single detail that they can. And that too was something we had to discover. And resisting the temptation of developers faced with a site full of historic lumber, to clear it and to get what, in a sort of naive way, might seem the most simple way forward, which is a cleared site. But a cleared site, a brownfield site in North Liverpool, is worth very, very little, whereas a brownfield site which has got its historic identity has much more potential value. Lesson 3, and this was the lesson which is a universal lesson with waterfront development. Waterfronts are working environments. They were cargo handling environments. They were handling valuable cargoes, so both from a security point of view and, as we would now say, a health and safety point of view, they were walled off with the dock police standing there at the gate, coming out of those wonderful turreted gatehouses to prevent entry. Whereas the theme of redevelopment is always open it up, the abierta hacia el mar, as they said in Barcelona. It's reopening to the sea, reconnecting the city to its waterfront, opening up the quayside sites to developers, opening up the quaysides themselves to pedestrians and latte drinking loafers who sit under the umbrellas and spin out their lives watching the play of the light on the water, and that's great. Long may they do so. So open up the quaysides, and then the hope is that there'll be a sort of backward effect, that the vibrancy of waterfront development then penetrates the city and helps all of us modernise our economies. And then the final thing, therefore, is that grow the city. And what is fantastic is how cities all over the world, the Amsterdam case, the fantastic cases you're going to be looking at with Dirk Schubert when he comes in a week's time or 2 weeks' time, whatever it is, and all over the world, waterfront development means the opportunity of an expansion slot for the city in what was always previously a no-go area. And this particular one is the way in which Edinburgh, we've just looked at Rowan's wonderful image of the new town in Edinburgh, which is down the hill, down the brook from Newtown is the Granton waterfront, and there we can see how the master plan is expanding the city. Now, there are lots of success stories in Docklands redevelopment, and Rowan's theme was success stories. We could talk about Birmingham, we could talk about Newcastle and the Sage and the way in which redeveloping the waterfront has enabled Newcastle to overcome its historic animosity with Gateshead and to see the two adjacent cities as one dynamic centre. There's the case of Nottingham, which I've already mentioned, where the modern economy of Nottingham has grown along the two waterfronts, one of the canal and the other of the River Trent. There's the case of Manchester, where despite all the efforts of Salford Quays, I wouldn't say that waterfront development has overcome the traditional animosity of Manchester and Salford. So the two cities continue to exist within their own bubbles, with the River Irwell sort of running between them. But nevertheless, maybe in some future golden age, the Irwell will become the sort of throbbing heart of Manchester stroke Salford, capital of the Northwest. Whoops. Or whatever. Let me just sort of take you through the other example, which is the London Docklands, because I moved into the London Docklands in 1979. So when I bought a house there, it was the docks, and on New Year's Eve you could hear all the ship's hooters hooting, and the Seamen's Mission was just up the street, and the church where I play the organ was a dockers' church, Irish stevedores. This was the scene, and it was a typical waterfront scene with essentially a low horizon, a watery horizon, nothing in sight but the odd crane, and then the looming shape of the warehouses through the gloom. And of course it has been an extraordinary success story. So if you go there with the same vantage point now, you see the towers of Canary Wharf, and you see, if you move in closely, a total transformation of the environment. And it's been a double transformation, because on the one hand you have commerce moving in, building a really large CBD, an office centre employing 150,000 people. To arrive at Canary Wharf on a Friday evening, late at night, maybe 10:30 in the evening, you hear this babble of voices in the air, and you realise there are hundreds of people just hanging around, talking, having a drink. It's extraordinary. But at any rate, the second wave has been apartments. So because you had the employment, it made sense to build these incredibly dense apartments at which these, yuppies who work on the trading floors can live. The formula worked in Canary Wharf. The question you have to ask yourself is it a replicable formula? Is it a formula that's going to work elsewhere? For example, along the Regent Road. Okay. What did Canary Wharf do? What it did was, it's a very good example, the London Docklands as a whole, is how the entire centre of gravity of a city with 8 million population was pulled into a space that had never existed. In the old days, cabbies who learned the knowledge in London were taught by a thing called the Blue Book, which had no destinations east of Tower Bridge. And what Canary Wharf did was it opened up an entire hidden sector of London. And that was a remarkable thing, which, again, Liverpool has the potential to do that in that sort of vacuum between Pierhead and the operational docks in Bootle. So just to finish with London, the interesting point about the story is that there's plenty more space to come. So that's the success stories. But now I'm going to, as it were, echo the previous speaker. Rowan's message was that much of our urban regeneration in this country has been disappointing. We know what we're trying to do, but we often fail to achieve it, and the disappointments have often been near water. So if we go back to those blue dots on my map and we visit waterfront redevelopments, and now you see the point is, any of you can do it on your browser. You can just get onto Street View and you can motor through these places. And I think as you do so, your heart will sink. Because would you want to buy one of these flats? Well, I don't know. Let's have a look. The reputation for waterfront redevelopment, particularly after the last property crash, is that waterfront spells somewhere which is bleak, which is disconnected, which is monofunctional, which has got very little footfall, which sometimes has attracted a load of sort of silly ideas, gestures, which don't add up. There was a book published last week by my old PhD supervisor, Peter, now Sir Peter Hall. And it's a book about exactly what we're talking about today. It's called Good Cities: How Europe Rediscovered the Lost Art of Urbanism. And it compares these wonderful cities in Europe, which have expanded onto their waterfronts, with the sadder story in the UK where, to quote page 2, we seem to have faltered and lost our way. Too many of our attempts at urban regeneration have been tawdry and superficial. Well, buy the book and read the story. So what's gone wrong? Well, it was very interesting, and I thank Jerry and Engage Liverpool for forcing me to sit down and think, what has gone wrong? And so here's my sort of 5-point version of the story. There's lots of ways of telling the story, but here are 5 for starters. First is excess road space. And as I do this, you can maybe think what might apply to the scheme for Liverpool Waters. And actually, you might come out with some rather surprising results. Travelling around the docks of Liverpool, of the UK, what strikes you is that the highway engineers were allowed to treat them as out-of-town sites. So in London, the Royal Docks are separated from their context by huge dual carriageways, surrounded by buffer landscapes with roundabouts, and the roundabouts then lead into the development sites. So it's a very typical out-of-town approach to highway design. And the same is true of Cardiff Bay, the peripheral distributor road, which opened up the whole of Cardiff Bay to development. It's fine, but you only get there by driving along a motorway. Glasgow Harbour, Castlebank Street, Edinburgh, Ocean Drive, Hull, Castle Street, the A63. The waterfront environment is often synonymous with a big dual carriageway, with full motorway-style roundabouts designed for driving around them at 60 miles an hour, with this big geometry for driving at speed. So the sad effect of this is Belfast. The highway acts as a barrier. So having opened up the waterfront, Albieta, Hacia el Mar, you then close it off again by putting this great trunk road designed for fast-moving traffic, where you should be building a sort of urban-style boulevard, or even just an ordinary, urban street, because what you're trying to do is grow the city. And then the second thing is the imbalanced dwelling mix. Now, this is a very, very well-known story, and I know it's a story very close to the heart of Engage Liverpool. And this is worth again remembering the history. There was a very important shift in the property market in the 1980s. Till the 1980s, nobody built urban flats. They were a totally unknown phenomenon. There was no such thing. There were council flats, but they were never in city centres, and they were built to family scale. They had 2 or 3 bedrooms. But this was a newfangled concept brought in the 1980s, the concept of the urban apartment for the yuppie lifestyle, so that young urban professionals like Jerry Proctor could could live their lifestyle in towns centrally located. Waterfronts were ideal. 50 square metres, 60 square metres, they were compact, is a nice way of putting it. They were desperately shorter spaces now, and they were produced by the property developers on a very large scale in the boom of the early years of the 20th century, because they were ideal investment vehicles. Property investment was slushing all around the world. Investors were buying off-plan on websites in speculative apartment towers. It could have been in Liverpool, it could have been in Manchester, it could have been in Shanghai. Money was flooding into this market, and it was a market totally disconnected from the cities to which these towers were contributing accommodation. So what we got was a disproportionate investment in undersized flats. Now, building for, young, single or, childless urban professionals is an important sector, but it's not the only sector. And if you only cater for that market, you cater for a very imbalanced slice of the population, and you'll never create sustainable urban neighbourhoods of the sort that Rowan has talked about. So we therefore need to look very, very carefully at the dwelling mix. Now what I'm showing you here is Peel Holdings, Salford Quays. These are dwellings on Salford Quays. You can see the environment, a terrible access road next to an inhospitable tramway. I know people, because I lived in Manchester for 17 years, who bought flats here and were absolutely horrified. I know a Finnish couple who came from central Helsinki, who thought this was the equivalent, and who were so horrified that they gave up highly paid jobs in the University of Manchester. The professor of economics abandoned Manchester and went back to Helsinki because he thought this city is unlivable. And he was right. I mean, this is unlivable if you take any long-time perspective. Thirdly, what's gone wrong? I've called it the Bilbao syndrome. I was very diverted to see that a student essay that I'd written, I was marking, called it the Bilbao syndrome. So this is, the ring that would... but I mean, we all know the syndrome, which is sort of based on the Guggenheim idea of a waterfront honeypot development, and it worked wonderfully in the centre of a dense, vibrant European city. A building with no right angles, all sort of slopey architecture, and wonderful things happening inside it, based on the concept of a contrast with its urban context. It did work there, but again, it was not a formula that was necessarily easy to reproduce elsewhere. And one of the hallmarks of waterfront development in this country has been you've got to have a building with odd angles. You've only got to get out to Pierhead, and you've got two of them. You go to Hull and you've got the Deep. You go to Belfast here and you've got the Titanic. The Titanic was meant to lead the whole redevelopment of the Titanic Quarter, but actually it's standing forlornly in a desert with nothing around it, just next to the Harland and Wolff drawing offices. Very fine building, by the way. The Sage at Gateshead, well, that's all right. The Imperial War Museum and Salford Quays, which is strange building, sort of isolated really in an industrial estate, with a Lowry opposite it, and again, a funny building, and not so convenient if you're going to the opera, and you have to travel on a tram, which takes half an hour, and then you've got to walk 20 minutes. Let's say you're going with your disabled mother. Not clever, really not clever at all. And so Bilbao syndrome, it can work, but treat it with care. Peel, I noticed, have reserved a site for an iconic arts building. So watch this space. Leading from that, architectural folly, well, unfortunately, waterfronts have become a sort of favourite cockpit for sort of artistic expressionism. Architects like Will Alsop have made a specialism and have produced some really very seriously silly ideas. If Urban Splash are in financial difficulties now, it's partly because their scheme in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Miles Platting, was designed facetiously by Will Alsop. Here we've got Barton Wilmore's prescription for Middlesbrough. Game architecture, toy town architecture, all colours and funny angles, isn't probably the best way forward if you're dealing with a difficult site and you're trying to nurture the growth of a city. There's a lot to be said for sobriety in urban regeneration. And finally, my last point has to do with trees and shrubs. Misplaced vegetation. I was very interested in my sort of travels round British docklands, which admittedly were largely conducted. I mean, I have actually visited a lot of them, I should say, but haven't necessarily had my camera with me. And so actually a lot of the images I've got now of docklands have been taken from Street View, but it is very interesting. You can manoeuvre your way around them. And what astonishes you in these new waterfront redevelopments built upon the harsh environment of concrete quaysides, which were all horizontality and flatness and naked surfaces. What is so astonishing is the amount of vegetation, because what happens is the landscapers are brought in to plant trees in the public realm. And every time a road engineer provides an over-engineered access system with no frontage on it, because that would interrupt the traffic flow, why ever not, but at any rate, then after the engineer is finished, there's a whole load of buffer space around the edges of the road which has to be planted up. You plant it up with saplings, and yesterday's sapling, 10 years on, is a 20 or 30 foot tree. So what's most astonishing is that the waterfronts of Britain are these sort of black forest environments. You know, you could actually go and camp in them. And probably the local homeless do. And in fact, I've actually seen people camping in buffer landscapes. So at the top you've got Leith, and on the bottom you've got Cardiff Bay. But the point about this type of vegetation is I think it's totally misplaced. We shouldn't have all these cotoneaster bushes and laurel hedges out in front of the buildings. What we should have, instead of external buffer planting, is to come back to Amsterdam, is internal courtyard gardens designed for family living. So, how to build waterfronts, the formula is what we in the trade call the perimeter block, not the point apartment, which can go up to 40 stories with a load of useless shrubs, B&Q style shrubs, you know, because they start off with a proper vegetation shape, and then over the years the contract gang comes in with their clippers, and so what you get is over time a more and more naked stalk with a sort of lollipop of increasingly wretched shrubbery. So this is not the way to bring nature into the heart of the cities. What you want is proper gardens. And what's interesting is if we cross the North Sea and we look at, on the top, Amsterdam, or on the bottom, Stockholm, nearly all the apartments here are designed as perimeter blocks. So nature is here in the heart of the residential developments. And that has lots of consequences. For one thing, it means you're designing for family living, safe places for play, for private recreation. It also is one way of helping to counter the problem of height, because as soon as you have internal courtyard gardens, you have to be conscious of height, you have to be conscious of shadow. You can't create the microclimate of an enclosed garden if you're building 40-storey towers next to it. So for lots of reasons, the first thing I looked at on the Peel scheme and the planning application was, are they conceiving perimeter blocks? And it's very interesting. There's a lot about precedents, and all of the precedents that they cite are perimeter blocks. When you actually look at their drawings, they're not thinking perimeter blocks. So in week 3 of this wonderful series, I think that would be a very interesting question to ask them. What typologies are you really envisaging on these quite narrow sites, but on this totally wonderful expanse of opportunity that confronts Liverpool over the next 30 years? Thank you very much indeed.